And now, to introduce our first keynote speaker, Justin Riddle is an assistant professor at Florida State University, investigating how neural oscillations support higher order cognition and underlie consciousness. Recent groundbreaking work discovered that psychedelic compounds, such as psilocybin, are an effective treatment for major depressive disorder. The intensity of so-called mystical experience during the psychedelic trip was positively correlated with treatment response. Unfortunately, these altered states are poorly understood, and better models will allow mental health practitioners to assist patients to integrate these psychedelic experiences. A challenge for scientific study is that the psychedelic trip is highly volatile with significant individuals. Advanced meditation techniques, on the other hand, allow the practitioners to systematically enter altered states of consciousness. Recent studies provide evidence that the states reached through advanced meditation can match and sometimes surpass the intensity of mystical experience produced by psychedelics. Justin and his collaborators are investigating the phenomenology and neural basis of these states. So today, Justin will be discussing leveraging advanced meditation to understand altered states of consciousness. If you would like to ask questions during this talk, please enter them in the Q&A function, and they will be addressed following Justin's talk. Without further ado, let's all give a warm welcome to Justin.
All right, thanks so much, Logan, for that introduction, and Andrea. Yeah, I had a really great time at the Psychedelic Science Conference, and yeah, one highlight was learning about IPN, and just seeing this really enthusiastic bunch of trainees and all that you all are, doing to organize together and support each other. So yeah, I think it's a really wonderful thing you all are doing. So yeah, I'm honored to be included, and to be able to share some of my work. So today I'll be talking about leveraging advanced meditation to understand altered states of consciousness. But to get to that point, I'm going to kind of take us on a journey through, a lot of what my lab is doing, some of the core questions that we're really interested in. And one of my goals today is to try to inspire you all to dive into science, think creatively, and use the tools at your disposal to push the field forward. All right, I'll start with some acknowledgments. The Advanced Meditation, aka Fire Casina team, is made up of Marjorie Woollacott, Nife Hermanson, Matthew Sackett, and Daniel Ingram. And just as a disclosure, I received funding from the Emergence Benefactors nonprofit, which is the CEO is Daniel Ingram, to conduct the research that I'll be reporting. The company did not have any influence on the reporting of results. And a shout out to Sham Dulashia, who is in IPN, and he was instrumental in collecting this data, helping with the analysis, and the interpretation of the results. And then finally, I want to just give a shout out to my collaborator, Jonathan Schooler. He's at UC Santa Barbara, and I'll be sharing with you today our nested observer windows model. This is our approach to understanding consciousness. So I'll be explaining this theory to you all, and so just want to recognize his contributions. All right, so the outline for today, why do we want to study consciousness? I'll kind of start from the basics and motivate, why consciousness is worth our time. I'll be making the case for neural oscillations, these macro scale electrical activity phenomenon in the brain, and why I believe these are the closest correlate to human cognition and really warrant our attention. And I'll be proposing a novel theory of hierarchical consciousness where the multiscalar nature of biology is manifested into our experience, into our psychology. And here is where I will make connection to the psychedelic experience, and in particular, this phenomenon of entity encounters, which also at the psychedelic conference last week, entity encounters were getting increasing amounts of attention from the community. So I will kind of set that up for you all. And then I'll end by talking about some of our work looking at advanced meditation practitioners and their ability to exhibit a lot of the same phenomenon that we see in the psychedelic experience. So, to launch us off into the nature of consciousness, I want to start with a brief story. So, this was when I was an undergraduate, and I had a friend who was a philosophy major, and she was actively in a philosophy of mind class, learning about what is consciousness, reading papers by people in the fields. And over the weekend, she took the drug LSD and had this really profound psychedelic experience. And she came back after having this trip and said, "Wow, I didn't realize that in my class I was studying a real thing." And it's kind of mind-blowing to even comprehend this, right? That you could be in a consciousness class interested in the nature of the mind, and yet only after having a psychedelic experience do you really realize, wow, there's something bizarre about consciousness that we don't understand. There's something that needs to be grappled with. There's something right in front of me that I didn't even realize I didn't understand until I kind of had my, face shoved into this phenomenon of whatever it is that is happening in our experience. And so I like this story because it's very bizarre. And I think it highlights, maybe what a lot of you in the audience have experienced, maybe having some formative trip that kind of inspired you to say, take a second glance at what it is that we are doing just by being alive, by being conscious. And to me, this is, really the motivation to do science, to uncover the nature of our minds. So, what is at the core of consciousness and why is it so mysterious? And here I am to tell you all, maybe something you already know, that we really genuinely don't understand consciousness whatsoever. And our theories of consciousness are all fairly rudimentary. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done just to even, get us past the starting line of really understanding what consciousness is. So, what are some of the mysteries? The mystery of the self. So, when we look at our brains, there's a bunch of brain structures. They all perform various cognitive functions and are related to different aspects of our experience. But what in our brain can we point to and say, there I am. Here is the one person having this one experience, this whole self. When I say me, when I refer to you, is there at all something in our brains, in our bodies that is whole, that is one experiencer? And bizarrely, a lot of modern science will try to tell you that there is no mind, there is no self, it's all an illusion. But I don't think we know one way or another. And definitely experientially, it feels like we have a single self, a single vantage point of our experience. Another fundamental mystery in the study of consciousness is qualia. Qualia refers to kind of the redness of a rose, the painful feeling of falling, the pain within pain, that subjective, squishy, warm, wet aspect of our minds. And when we look at the methods of science, we're often doing what I'm depicting here on the right. If I gave you a set of Legos and I asked you to create the feeling of love out of Legos, maybe you'd make this emoji heart shape out of the Legos, but it seems fundamentally challenging to create an emotion or a feeling by just stacking physical stuff on top of each other. And so, why would it be any different if you have chemical or electrical impulses in the brain? How can we take physical phenomenon and stack them together and then create something that has feelings, that has emotions, that has this squishy, warm subjectiveness to it? This is a fundamental unanswered question. Free will. Do your choices matter? The status quo in modern science is that your choices don't matter. You're just a genetic, chemical, electrical concoction moving from, one series of states to the next, like dominoes falling in a line. You have no choice, you have no will, we're all just along for the ride. Although, do we know that? No, we don't know that. And I would argue that maybe we do have free will. Do I know what it is? Of course not. I'm not here to tell you that I know what free will is, but it seems to be a very fundamental aspect of our experience, core to who we are, to why we get up in the morning. And so this, I think, is one of the core unanswered mysteries of consciousness. Purpose. Is there a point to all this? Once again, scientists might tell you that we just disappear when we die and we're just a bunch of, dirt and chemicals that emerged from the earth. But why bother? Why is there something rather than nothing? Isn't it much more simple just to live in a black hole of nothingness? Why has the universe bothered creating anything at all? Why are we here? And understanding systems of meaning and seeking a system of meaning to explain the maybe significance or purpose of our lives, I think is one of the ultimate questions that needs to be addressed. And then I threw this one in at the end. Time is very mysterious. We have the subjective experience of moving from the past into the future, and yet it is always right now. It has always been the present moment. It is the present moment at this moment, and the next moment, and the next moment. And time is quite bizarre. And show me a good theory of time out there. They don't really exist. So, why do I bring up these mysteries of consciousness? One, just to inspire you all as kind of the next generation that there's a lot of work to be done, and this is a wide open space. And I think any of these varieties of questions are ripe for investigation. But then I also use this as kind of a way to contextualize the model of consciousness that I'll be proposing to you, which has some novel solutions to this. So first, what is kind of status quo theorizing on the nature of consciousness? Well, status quo is that neurons are the substrate of the mind, that the capacity for neurons to hold an electrical charge and to integrate electrical inputs and generate electrical output, this neural spiking operation that neurons are performing, is the de facto neural substrate of cognition. And viewing each neuron as a little integrate and fire microcomputer, this distributed neural network. This is the kind of gold standard, default way of thinking about how the mind might be instantiated in the brain. But what are some caveats to this theory? Well, the status quo is that if we want to study consciousness, we need to study neurons, right? The neural level is the ultimate level. And we have a bit of a reductionist bias where, okay, there might be larger brain structures in the brain, but those are really just a collection of neurons, and we can, kind of ignore these large brain networks, brain structures. They're just kind of an imperfect way of viewing the actual neural substrate of neural circuits and proteins and protein pathways. These maybe support the neural level fundamentally, or you could make the argument that the neuron itself is actually just a little too macroscopic, and true neuroscientists are the ones that study proteins. And even studying neurons, you're just studying this macro structure that isn't really real. We all know that neurons are just made out of synapses and synaptic potentials. And so to discuss the neuron on its own is kind of, an incomplete story. We got to dive into the proteins. But you could make the same argument that proteins are just made out of chemicals and atomic forces. And, we should essentially all become particle physicists, and then we should all become mathematicians. And, the reductionist bias goes on and on. But what I'm going to propose to you today is what is called the hierarchical solution. So, what if there was meaningful information processing occurring at multiple scales within the brain. Yes, neurons are processing and computing information for cognition for our lives, but maybe there are more macroscopic structures in the brain that genuinely process information in and of themselves. And potentially proteins represent this microcosm within neurons that are processing information at this lower, more microscopic level. And in a way, this is, a kind of a kumbaya moment where all approaches to neuroscience are meaningfully contributing. People like me doing EEG and MRI at this more macro scale, maybe we are studying genuine information processing in the brain. And people doing circuit models and systems neuroscience, they too are contributing to our understanding of cognition and the human experience. And then finally, people that are hardcore biologists down with their petri dishes and nuclear magnetic resonance are also contributing meaningfully to understanding these systems. So, what is the case for the macro scale? Because I think if you're looking at this and you've taken, undergraduate biology or undergraduate neuroscience, you're quite comfortable with neurons and proteins, but maybe you're squinting your eyes at this nucleus, brain, functional brain region, brain network level, and saying, well, at the very least, that one seems a little funky to me. So here is the pitch, okay? The pitch is that you are a giant, slow, lumbering creature, okay? Your thoughts are occurring at a very slow, rhythmic scale. And I'm going to give some examples to really highlight this. So, as I am speaking to you, if I were to record the audio waves coming out of my mouth, and run it through some signal processing analysis, decompose it into a sum of sine waves with the Fourier transform, you'll see that in our speech, there's a very prominent rhythmic structure to the rate at which we are talking. And you can actually look across cultures. You can look at people speaking French, people speaking Chinese or Mandarin. You can look at various forms of English, Dutch, German. And no matter what language you look at, there's this really pronounced, roughly 6 hertz, 6 times per second vibration in our words. And what this shows us is that we have these biological behavioral rhythms that we are exhibiting. And interestingly, you can find these rhythms also in the brain. So there's been a number of studies, and here I'm just highlighting, one that I found very interesting. But the rate at which we are producing audio in speech and the rate at which we're receiving audio in speech is roughly in what's called the theta rhythm, about 6 times per second. And as you are listening to speech or sounds, you can see electrical rhythms being entrained in the auditory cortex. There's literal electrical rhythms tracking with my words. And if you're paying attention to my words, then you will see in your auditory cortex these rhythmic electrical vibrations tracking with the speed at which I am speaking. Also, non-coincidentally, at the same rhythm, your eyes are darting around in what's called microsaccades. So even if you're attempting to fixate on my zoom pixelation here. Your eyes are still vibrating and darting around. And if you were to search a novel scene, your eyes too would dart around. And the rate at which your eyes are moving, once again, is in this theta rhythmic frequency range. And so, what you find is that if you show people video and audio simultaneously, you find entrainment in the visual system and the auditory system in the same frequency, in the same rhythm at this very macro electrical scale of the brain. And when you are encoding that information into your memory, then you see all sorts of beautiful electrical coupling between these visual and auditory sources. You see the information transmitting throughout various brain networks, brain structures, such as the hippocampus, which is important for memory consolidation. And all of this is tracking with these low frequency behavioral features. So the argument here is that these macroscopic rhythms are relevant because they actually align very, very well with our real subjective experience. As you're experiencing your world, your life, the rate at which you're experiencing the world is very slow. Neurons are very fast, proteins doubly so, very, very fast, and yet you are slow and lumbering. And then the question is, how do these systems connect up? A brief aside into neural oscillations. If I measure in the brain, you can see neural spiking. You can see these electric field oscillations. The electric field oscillations correspond with these macro scale systems, and the action potentials or spiking corresponds to these more microscopic scale. And a metaphor that I like to use is of locomotion in a train. If you think about, what is at the core of your brain, moving your cognition, your experience from one moment to the next, we often think neurons and neural spiking. This is kind of the engine of the train. And yes, we can measure these electric fields that kind of emerge from the mass action of populations of neurons. And yes, they're there, but they don't really do anything. And this is called epiphenomenalism from philosophy. And it's the concept that, yes, even if you can observe something, maybe it's there, but it doesn't do anything. Another example is like the sound that your heart makes is not essential to the beating of your heart, right? The musculature of your heart beating is irrelevant to the sound, or the sound is irrelevant to that musculature. So maybe these oscillations don't really do anything. However, we can use things like transcranial magnetic stimulation to causally test the role of these macro scale electric fields in the brain. So, a brief primer, this is a non-invasive brain stimulation technique where essentially a high voltage electric current is passed through a coil that generates a magnetic field that goes into your brain, and then that gets converted back into electricity. And this is a way of like snapping your fingers and activating high voltage electricity in the brain to, make your muscles twitch or do various things to your brain. But this gives us a powerful ability to test for the causal role of macro scale brain activity. So one technique that I have been really fascinated by is the ability to entrain neural oscillations using non-invasive brain stimulation. So, for example, rhythmic TMS, you send pulses to the brain, and this will drive an electrical fluctuation in the brain. So I don't, expect you to fully understand this slide, but we can measure using electrical recordings of the brain simultaneous with our magnetic pulses. And we can show that as we deliver these magnetic pulses, you can drive these electric field rhythms in the brain. So what these studies look like is we can measure correlation wise. We measure these large scale electric fields in the brain that correspond with maybe remembering some colored squares or actively forgetting some colored squares. And so we can see a correlation between some brain activity and some cognitive process. And then what we can do is deliver rhythmic magnetic stimulation to these regions in the brain. And we're now going to drive these rhythmic electric field fluctuations in these brain regions. And the question here is, can we change human cognition by changing these brain rhythms? And the short answer is yes. And I won't go into like the details of this study just for the sake of time, but basically there's sort of preferred rhythms in the brain. One rhythm in prefrontal cortex related to remembering items, another rhythm in parietal cortex related to actively forgetting items. And when we align our stimulation with the endogenous activity, essentially we can boost that endogenous neural activity, and then that improves cognition. And when we disrupt that activity, we can impair cognition. So to kind of pause here for a second, This is a very powerful and interesting technique where not only can we measure macroscopic electric fields in the brain, but using the tools of modern cognitive neuroscience, we can drive electrical rhythms with our brain stimulators and then change cognition in a systematic manner. And, we replicated this study. All right, so where does that leave us? Well, looking at this picture of the multiple scales within the brain, we now have a lot of emerging causal evidence that if we change the activity patterns of these very macroscopic brain activity patterns, we do change cognition, we do alter brain activity directly. And so this more macro scale may legitimately be processing information in its own right at this more macroscopic level. But, these macro structures are not floating up in the clouds above the neurons. They need to be connected to these lower scales. And so this leads to a number of various phenomenon and mechanisms. But one of the kind of interesting concepts from philosophy is called downward causation. So this is the idea that can there be activities in these macroscopic scales that then influence the lower levels and change the lower levels? And critically, and this is kind of a nuanced point, but we'll, hit it in a number of different ways in the subsequent slides. These higher levels are not just one-to-one reducible to the lower levels, but there might be information processing happening at multiple scales simultaneously. So what is downward causation? Well, to give like a simple example, close your eyes, think about someone you love, and the question here is, did my words just generate an oxytocin or a dopamine release inside of your brain? Did I cause you to generate a chemical reaction inside of your brain? And if we go, hard traditional neuroscience approach, we would say, no, I didn't. Our brains are just chemical electrical structures smashing into each other, and we're having these simultaneous, you know, experiences that are arising. But in this kind of downward causation example, I'm causing my brain to generate words that go over to you, that goes and interacts with your mind, and then maybe generates some sort of brain response. So this, to use another philosophy term, this is called strong emergence. Is there some sort of macro structure in your brain which corresponds with you and genuinely exists at some higher level of processing? Okay, so I know this might sound kind of abstract right now, but I'm gonna circle around to this in a second. So, how do these levels interact with each other? One proposal that I've been diving into a lot, and there's a lot of people kind of on this same trip here, is cross-frequency coupling. And this is the proposal that macroscopic low-frequency systems can meaningfully couple to and interact with more microscopic high-frequency systems. And this was first observed in the hippocampus, where they found that as rats were navigating mazes, you saw the emergence of theta frequency electrical rhythms in the hippocampus, and those were coupled to and interacting with individual neurons activating at a much more high frequency scale. So this was kind of the first observation that macroscopic brain structures were interacting with the individual neural level. Okay. And this has since been replicated into a number of different cognitive processes or expanded into different cognitive processes. And this is proposed to be the mechanism where you're seeing interactions between these macro scales and these more micro scales. And potentially there's interactions between even the neural scale and more microscopic levels, right? So we're kind of creating evidence for each of these levels performing meaningful computations. And then we're finding and looking for ways that these various levels can connect up to each other. And once again, this requires causal testing. So a lot of my more recent research has been really diving into things like electrical stimulation, where we can mimic these cross-frequency coupling rhythms and deliver electrical stimulation to human participants and drive coupling between these more macro and micro structures, and then observe changes in cognition. So, what does this mean from a consciousness perspective? Well, this is where the nested observer windows model comes in. What if all of these observations of cross-frequency coupling in neuroscience have a really fundamental relationship to consciousness? So let's take cross-frequency coupling seriously. And by take it seriously, I mean let's take it really, really seriously. So the nested observer windows model proposes that what if there were nested cognitive systems inside of your mind? That the brain is showing us that there are these nested biological systems inside of each other. What if this is also true psychologically? That in your experience, there's almost like mosaic tiles inside of your experiential vantage point, and those are arising from smaller, we call them observer windows or cognitive systems, and each of those is made up of tiles and so on and so forth. So we use the metaphor of mosaic tiles. A mosaic tile is an image made out of smaller tiles, and then each of those tiles collectively form a gestalt image. Here we propose that they are nested, where if you were to zoom into any one of these tiles, you would then see another mosaic tiling, and so on and so forth. Each of those tiles would then reveal a nesting. So in the nested observer windows model, we propose that just as neurons are nested within functional brain regions, maybe there are there is you at this macro scale in your brain. We call you the apex observer window, and within your vantage point of experience are many smaller cognitive systems nested inside of you, having semi-autonomous cognitive experiences, and those are then projected to smaller and smaller levels. In the paper, check it out. It's open access, free to download for anyone. You know, we use the example of functional brain regions and neurons as example observer windows that are nested within each other, and we speculate on what that apex observer window might look like. So this model generates testable predictions for cognitive neuroscience. So instead of viewing everything as monolithically a bunch of neurons interacting, we propose that there's a level of the apex of functional brain regions of neurons, and each of these levels have different electrical phenomena that you can go in and quantify and relate to cognition. And this really views human experience as a fundamentally nested system. So I'm not going to dive into these for the sake of time, but check out the paper if you want to learn more. But what does this mean psychologically? Okay. So the main pitch of the nested observer windows model is that you have a deep and vast subconsciousness inside of you. Okay. Carl Jung defines the subconscious as cognitive processes that were at one time conscious and have become automatized. We're okay with that definition, but we have kind of a more expanded definition. What if there are cognitive systems inside of your mind at faster, more microscopic scales of your biology, and these cognitive systems inside of you represent your subconsciousness? As you're thinking, you might get a fully formed thought form that shows up in your mind. Where did that thought come from? Maybe that thought emerged from these lower level cognitive systems. You have a limited ability to interface with your nested systems. You're kind of at this macro scale, more abstract. You're very slow and lumbering and giant inside of your body, inside of your brain. But inside of you is a bunch of very, very fast cognitive systems generating a lot of content, throwing them up into your mind, and you're interfacing and dynamically interacting with this nested system of subconscious agents inside of you. And oftentimes it's difficult to see where in our mind these different cognitive systems are coming from. So we propose this kind of obstruction through binding, where as you are having all these cognitive streams emerge into your mind, you're binding them into one narrative experience of your life, and it's kind of obscuring the origin points of these different cognitive sources. So I think some realization of this model in the domain of psychotherapy is the internal family systems model. So this is a therapy developed by Richard Schwartz, and he was a family therapist. And what he realized was that he could roll out his family therapy in individuals. It's as if you have a bunch of family members inside of your mind, and he conceptualizes the self as being made out of parts, and each of these parts are the family members, and psychiatric illness, cognitive dissonance arises from a lack of coherence or a lack of community between your inner family. And I really love this as a metaphor for really thinking about the nested observer windows model. The idea is that, you didn't get to choose who your parents are or who, your family members are. And similarly, you don't get to choose who your nested observer windows are. You have an inner family of conscious cognitive agents inside of you, and you have to learn to live with yourselves. And maybe a part of our lives is building a relationship with our nested subfamily, and therapies in the future will kind of acknowledge this kind of nesting structure within our psychology. And this might be a fundamental way that we kind of engage with psychotherapy in the future. The now model also makes sense of a few different psychiatric symptoms. One of them, dissociative identity disorder. This is something that occurs within psychosis, where there's kind of a breakdown of the self into many different personalities. You kind of become a system of different personalities coexisting. I had the privilege of talking with someone who has DID, and they described to me, they reached out after reading the Now Model paper, and they described that the paper really summarized what it felt like to be them. They had dominant personalities at this higher level, and then nested systems of more microscopic personalities that they had to manage within their nested subsystems. And it was really compelling to learn of this person's experience and then relate it to the Now Model. There's also a number of other phenomenon like tulpa and tulpamancy. So this is the creation of an imaginary friend in your mind. So a tulpa is a willfully created imaginary friend. There's a growing Reddit community, and this was grew out of kind of the neurodivergent My Little Pony fandom in kind of an interesting historical way. But while we might scoff at these kind of foreign ideas to our own experience, maybe some of you had imaginary friends when you were children. And is this compatible within the Now model? What if you were to start to learn about your inner family system and start to grant agency and respect for some of these semi-autonomous subsystems? Could you then have a fully fledged tulpa in your experience that seems to be acting autonomously from yourself? And so milestones, one of the milestones of tulpamancy is when your tulpa starts to talk to you in a way that doesn't feel like you're making up what they're saying. So in the beginning, you're kind of imagining the conversation and you're kind of making up both sides. But once you get good at it, then the tulpa can start to talk back independently, and you don't feel like you're creating their experience. I think there might be some interesting parallels that are emerging within the psychedelic community. So Terence McKenna, who's one of kind of the, I don't know, popularizers of the use of DMT, he famously discussed that on high dose DMT, there's encounters with these DMT machine elves, and furthermore, there's, growing recognition of entity encounters either through DMT, high dose LSD, psilocybin, particularly in ayahuasca, which is activating DMT, where encounters are the experience of interacting with some sort of seemingly fully autonomous social emotional creature thing that you are talking to. And one proposal that we have recently thinking about the now model is, what if this is some sort of manifestation of micro entities, nested substructures within your mind? And this is kind of gaining awareness of the kind of rich subconscious system just beneath your apex observer window. There's kind of a long-standing acknowledgement of these kind of hierarchies of beings that potentially exist inside of you. Rick Strassman, who did one of the early studies on DMT, he went into his studies giving IV infusions of DMT to participants at University of New Mexico as a Zen Buddhist, and he was looking for this ego death experience. And what he found was this rich entity encountered reality that people were having. And he actually went back to the Bible. And I don't know many people have like read this book, but it's really fascinating. DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, where he pairs Bible passages of prophetic images with um, entity encounters and geometric imagery witnessed by his participants in his DMT studies. And he, kind of started to think about the world as maybe being supportive of having entity encounters, right? Which is kind of, it was originally a challenge to his Zen Buddhist background. As a caveat, I think there's this really interesting emerging dichotomy between the more Zen Buddhist compatible ego death experience and the more, Judeo-Christian hierarchy of beings experience with NN-DMT, or the more traditional form of DMT. So where do we see entity encounters throughout our culture? If you, I've recently gone down this road of rethinking a lot of the authors and things that I have enthusiastically consumed in the past. One of them, Carl Jung. Carl Jung embarked on this journey of what he called active imagination, where he had self-induced hallucination trips in his evening. And one of the hallmarks of those experiences was that he encountered entities. And he viewed these as manifestations of what he called the collective unconsciousness. But no matter how you slice it, he was essentially having repeat entity encounters with these beings that he was engaging in conversation with. You have different practices throughout history, like Tantric Buddhism, where they will do things like deity yoga, where they will summon entities and build a relationship with them. And I think what's interesting here is, kind of coming from a Judeo-Christian background myself, when I look at, these deity practices in the past, I might have thought, oh, it's like a metaphor, right? Like, oh, it's a deity, it's just like a metaphor. But now, kind of, viewing this from the domain of all these entity encounters that we've been discussing, in these practices, people report actually encountering entities in their meditative practice or in their yogic practice. And is this, a real experience that they're actually having, right? It's not a metaphor to them. It's like a genuine experience that is taking place. Similarly, we're seeing the rise of ayahuasca ceremonies where entity encounters are becoming more and more commonplace. And there's a couple, more bizarre examples from like the New Age movement with like alien channeling, where people claim that they're speaking to extra dimensional beings and these entities that claim to be aliens, right? So entity encounters, I think, are becoming quite prominent in our culture, and I think there's a lot of convergence in maybe interest trying to study this. At Psychedelic Science last week, Chris Timmerman reported some findings. I didn't include them on a slide because I couldn't find them online, so I don't want to report things that aren't out in the world. But he was having people do IV DMT and in the MRI scanner and showing a contrast between having an entity encounter versus not having an entity encounter on DMT. So I think there's growing recognition and interest in this psychological phenomenon. All right, advanced meditation. So I'm going to kind of like slam through this real quick here, but advanced meditation, this is not your mindfulness-based stress reduction of therapeutically trying to calm yourself down. This is people attempting to go off the deep end of what is possible within their own mind in order to learn about themselves, to learn about the nature of the universe, to learn about the nature of consciousness. And historically, there's been a lot of exploration of these various states of consciousness that can be that can be accessed. So one of them are from Buddhism, the jhana states. And there's people nowadays like Matthew Sackett who is using advanced meditators that are able to systematically move through these different jhana states, for example, and study the neural correlates of these phenomenon. So I think we're seeing in parallel to this psychedelic movement occurring within science, we're also seeing this movement of advanced meditation, really thinking about meditation as not just some way to calm yourself down, but a way to actually access these very exotic states of consciousness. And people that have engaged in meditation, these advanced meditators with decades of experience, they claim that they have had all of the psychedelic phenomenological experiences from the access point of advanced meditation. So, this is a study that I participated in, or like I helped collect data for. This is fire casino meditation. This is a kind of form of advanced meditation practice that is really only practiced in people with decades of experience. And it's particularly powerful in inducing open-eyed visual hallucinations, as I'll show in a future slide, entity encounters, and people are able to tap into the intensity and range of psychological experiences that people access in psychedelics. So we, in this study, used the Mystical Experiences Questionnaire that was developed by Barrett and Griffiths for psychedelic research, and we administered it in people that had participated in these very intense fire casino meditations, and they were reporting intense experiences on the order of or exceeding that of DMT trips, ayahuasca trips, and high dose psilocybin. So these are people reporting extremely profound experiences that were of very high intensity. So this inspired a observational study, and this is kind of ongoing, but this is a 17-day advanced meditation retreat. We've done the first retreat. We're about to do the second retreat in the fall. And here we're acquiring high density EEG and doing a variety of cognitive tasks and meditations while people are undergoing this very intense trip via advanced meditation. And so, these are kind of preliminary results as of now, but we're seeing, a lot of this really intense emergent phenomenology that is taking place in these individuals. We're replicating some of these canonical findings of shutting down the default mode network as people go into these very intense meditative states. And we plan to look at brain activity and or brain networks in particular. So, for the sake of time, I'm unfortunately breezing through this a little bit. bear with me. But I want to highlight entity encounters. So 4 out of the 9 participants in the first retreat reported having entity encounters. And here's, one quote from our interview with them. And I'll skip a little bit, but they started to cry with the intensity of recalling this experience. I began to look at the eyes of the goddess who mirrored me at times and who I began to have a relationship with. And I connected with her and created a connection from my heart to her, along with psychedelic breakthrough visuals. And she revealed herself to me. And it is clear she is Paradevi, because of many signs, including her being surrounded by infinity, which is her aspect. And she showed me so many things. And it goes on, but multiple people had these quite profound entity encounters. They weren't always deities. One person encountered Jim Morrison in their experience. So, what does this all mean? Putting it all together, I think the hierarchical perspective on consciousness, on biology, is highly novel. I think we need to move away from kind of this unidimensional neural level of viewing brain activity. We have a lot of evidence that there's nested systems within us. And I think this has really profound implications for our psychology. And interestingly, when you're taking DMT and you're talking to the DMT elves, this is a very bizarre experience, for sure. But is this really so bizarre? Is this coming in contact with your own hierarchical mind? Are you seeing manifestations of these micro cognitive systems? And is this something profound about the way that our brain is organized and the way that our cognition is organized? And I think there's a lot of, emerging techniques that we can use at our disposal to get into this. So if you want to learn more, check out my YouTube channel. I'm recruiting PhD students to start next year. So if this kind of research interests you, check it out. And thank you to our funding, and in particular, Sham, who's in the IPN and who helped out a lot with everything you've seen today. So, all right, thank you for your attention. And I have barely any time for questions, so apologies on that front. But
Thank you, Dr. Ritter. I think we can permit one question.
all right, yeah,
Uh,
anything burning?
so one attendee asked, first they said, Dr. Riddle, thank you so much for your amazing lecture. They said they are particularly excited by your integration of neuroscience and IFS. I'm curious, how would this theory be applied to clinical studies?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think internal family systems is very, very compelling, and I think it's quite ahead of its time. I think there's a number of ways that maybe internal family systems could be compared with other psychotherapy approaches. Maybe looking at cross-frequency coupling as a predictor of response to internal family systems therapy. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done there. I also think that internal family systems weirds people out and makes people uncomfortable. And if you look at the that whole drama with the FDA rejecting MDMA as a psychotherapy, one thing that they used against the MDMA assisted psychotherapy was their use of internal family systems therapy. And I think it was, kind of used as a way to like mock the approach and saying, oh, they're using this completely preposterous internal family systems therapy. And it was used as a like way to deride the researchers, which I thought was very unfair, but also kind of showcases how these ideas are weird, and I like fully acknowledge how weird they are. So I think, yeah, just doing basic studies on IFS as a really effective psychotherapy, that alone needs to take place. And I think it's just a matter of time until people, catch on to how impactful this therapy is. And I think that us kind of neuroscientists can do our part to contribute a framework for interpreting internal family systems. Great question.
All right, thank you, Justin. That was a very thought-provoking discussion. I look forward to exploring all your ideas in my own time. And you and your work are very much an inspiration to the members of IPN. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. IPN is doing some great stuff. So yeah, keep it up, y'all. And I'm happy to contribute in whatever ways I can. So thank you for the platform and enjoy your meeting, everyone.
Dr.
Goodbye.
Justin, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay. First, thank you so much for your very inspiring talk. We have more questions from two participants. If you want to go ahead, Logan. Um,
Oh, yeah, sorry. Um, yes, so another question. Uh, if you could speak on your take on the central nervous system involved, such as the spinal involvement in the hierarchy.
Nice. That's a great question. Yeah, interestingly, a lot of my work has been diving into the relationship between prefrontal cortex and the motor system, and by extension, the spinal cord. One thing I've been really interested in recently is just, can we see manifestations of higher order cognition in our musculature, in our bodies? And if we are this like deeply interconnected multi-scalar system, then this would be something that we would find. And a lot of my work has been diving into what's called delta beta coupling, where traditionally there's been a lot of emphasis on hippocampus and theta gamma coupling, which is really related to perceptual processing. I've been very much interested in decision making and prefrontal control over the motor system. And it appears that there's like a different set of frequency bands related to motor control and related to kind of top-down manifestation of our goals into our bodies, which is, in a frequency domain different from kind of the bottom-up perceptual information that arises. So, yes, synchronistically, a very spot-on question to what I actually do in my day job.
All right, thank you. And now, before we let you go, we want to just give you one more question. So do you hold that there is a real potential in the study of consciousness to gain genuinely scientific answers to the big questions in the beginning of the presentation? For example, to find out why there is even a sense of purpose, thus what the meaning of meaning might be, phrased differently again, why we can ask why, and when we would be breaching into realms of philosophical questions.
100%. Yeah, I mean, I would hope that my research on some level is contributing to these bigger questions. I think the one question out of the ones I proposed was the idea of a self, right? So if the apex observer window, we can find a substrate for it in the brain, it would be evidence that there's some sort of macroscopic single self that is arising. As for the other questions, I just think it's important that more people are coming out with their experiences. And I saw a really good talk by Carl Hart at the Psychedelic Science Conference saying that people need to kind of come out of the closet with their own psychedelic experiences. And I think we need to come out of the closet with our beliefs on consciousness. Like, I believe in free will. I think there's a purpose to life. I think there's more going on than meets the eye. I don't necessarily have like the answers, but neither do people that say there is no free will, you're not real, everything's a lie, everything's just genetic chemical reactions. So I think at the very least we should be brave enough to try to address these hard questions and kind of make a case for things that we believe in because as scientists we're building a foundation of knowledge, but we're also disseminating purpose and meaning, and we're trying to connect to culture and connect to society and push the needle on societal, topics. And so I think there is a place for science to make comment upon philosophical questions, and I think that's kind of an emerging responsibility that we have as scientists to also go out of our comfort zone and maybe apply our research to things that we don't have all the evidence for, and yet we find it to be important and it's a way that we can kind of contribute to society meaningfully. So, you know, get out there and fight the good fight, and we'll see what we can do.
All right. Thank you for your very thoughtful answers. Um, and that will conclude our talk and Q&A with you, Justin. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you
All
very much.
right.